6 nautical miles. That is the distance forecasters have placed between the center of a strengthening typhoon and a small volcanic island in the far northern Pacific late on Saturday night. 6 nautical miles is about 11 kilometers. It is a distance you could walk before lunch. It is shorter than the drive many of you make to your grocery store. And on Saturday night, if the current forecast holds, that is how much ocean will separate the eye of Typhoon Saudel from an island called Agrihan. The last time a typhoon did this to Agrihan, every house on the island was destroyed. Not most of them, every one. The people who lived there could not stay, and they were taken off the island entirely. That was 61 years ago, and the storm that did it rapidly intensified in almost exactly the same patch of water Soudel is crossing right now. I want to be careful with you from the first minute, because this is a story with a real ending nobody has written yet. What is happening in the Western Pacific this weekend is not a prediction of catastrophe. It is a countdown with a blank space at the end of it. The ocean underneath this storm is deciding how strong it becomes. The atmosphere above it has not yet decided where it goes. Japan, Taiwan, Korea, China, 4 doors are open, and the forecast models cannot agree which one Soudel walks through. If you want to follow that answer as it arrives over the next several days, subscribing now is the simplest way to get it because we will be tracking this system through every stage of it. Here is where things stand. Soudel is the 18th named storm of the Western Pacific season, and it carries a name submitted by Micronesia that refers to a legendary chief's bodyguard. It began as a tropical depression, the 17th of the season in the numbering the Joint Typhoon Warning Center uses, and it strengthened into a tropical storm midweek. In its most recent position report, Soudel sat about 348 kilometers east of Saipan, moving north-northwestward at 22 kilometers an hour. Its winds were near 85 kilometers an hour. Its central pressure had fallen to 994 hectopascals. The seas around it were already running with a maximum significant wave height of 5.8 meters, call that 19 feet, which is a 2-story wall of water arriving over and over again, and that is before the storm has even become a typhoon. Now look at what forecasters expect it to do next, because this is the part that changes the whole shape of the story. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center's intensity ladder is steep enough that it is worth going through rung by rung. 80 knots by late Friday evening, 95 knots by Saturday morning, 110 knots by Saturday night, and a forecast peak of 125 knots by Sunday. 125 knots is roughly 230 kilometers an hour. That is around 145 miles an hour of sustained wind, with gusts forecast near 165. Independent forecast tables put the peak at 220 kilometers an hour in about 60 hours from the last update, holding that intensity for a full day before easing. Translate that. A sustained wind of 220 kilometers an hour is faster than most passenger trains you have ever ridden, applied not for a moment but for hours, without pause, to everything standing upright. Wind damage does not rise in a straight line with wind speed. The force on a structure climbs with the square of the speed. Doubling the wind roughly quadruples the load. That is why the difference between a strong tropical storm and a Category 4 typhoon is not a difference of degree. It is a difference of category in the older sense of the word, a different kind of event entirely, in which the failure mode stops being broken branches and starts being roofs leaving buildings. And Soudel is expected to make that climb in about a day and a half. The word forecasters use for this is rapid intensification, and the technical threshold is a jump of about 30 knots in 24 hours. What is being forecast here goes well past that. The Warning Center described a lengthy period of rapid intensification over the next 36 hours. It also noted that multiple automated rapid intensification aids have triggered. These are statistical tools that scan the environment for the fingerprints of an explosive strengthening event, and when several of them fire at once, forecasters take the high end of the range seriously. In this case, the center deliberately placed its intensity forecast on the upper end of the model envelope. That is a quiet phrase, and it means something loud. It means the official forecast is not the middle of the guesses, it is near the top of them on purpose. So why here and why now? Three things are feeding this storm, and they happen to be lined up almost perfectly. The first is the water. Sea surface temperatures east of the Marianas are running above 30 degrees Celsius. That is bath water. That is warmer than most heated swimming pools. A tropical cyclone is, at its core, a heat engine that converts the temperature difference between a warm ocean and a cold upper atmosphere into wind. And the warmer the bottom of that engine runs, the more violently it can spin. The second is what lies beneath the water, and this matters more than the surface number. Forecasters flagged high ocean heat content in this region. Ocean heat content measures not just the skin temperature of the sea, but how deep the warmth goes. A shallow layer of warm water is a small fuel tank. A storm churns it, drags cold water up from below, and chokes on its own wake. A deep layer of warm water is a large fuel tank, and no matter how hard the storm stirs, it keeps finding more heat underneath. Soudel is crossing a large tank. The third is the exhaust. The center described strong dual-channel outflow, and this is the piece most people never hear about. Air spirals inward at the surface and rises through the eye wall, and it has to go somewhere at the top. If it piles up aloft, the whole circulation strangles. Dual-channel outflow means the storm has found two clean exit routes at high altitude, venting in two directions at once. Picture a fire in a room with two open windows instead of one. It does not just burn, it roars. Warm surface, deep heat, two open windows. That is the recipe, and Soudel is sitting in the middle of it, which brings us back to that 6-mile number and to the people it belongs to. The islands in the direct path are the far northern islands of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Agrihan, Pagan, Alamagan. These are not resort islands. They are steep volcanic cones rising out of deep ocean, sparsely inhabited, and in some seasons inhabited by only a handful of people at a time. In the most recent closest approach table, the center of Soudel was forecast to pass within 6 nautical miles of Agrihan late Saturday night, within 26 nautical miles of Pagan on Saturday evening, and about 159 nautical miles from Saipan on Saturday morning. Read that last number again, because it is the good news buried in the middle of this. Saipan is the populated heart of the Commonwealth, and the forecast track keeps the center a comfortable distance away from it. Tinian and Rota sit farther still. Guam appears to be out of harm's way entirely on this one. The tens of thousands of people who live in the Southern Marianas are on the current track, watching this storm rather than absorbing it. The far northern islands are a different situation, and the detail that stays with me is how those residents are told to communicate when a storm approaches. The Emergency Operations Center reaches them by high-frequency single sideband radio on a frequency of 5.205 MHz. Not a phone tree, not an app, a radio frequency across open ocean to a volcanic peak with no crowd on it. When the Weather Service urged preparation for what it described as the few people known to be in the northern islands, that phrasing was doing a lot of work. The few people known to be there. There is one more human detail here that I keep turning over. On Saipan, Saturday was supposed to be a rescheduled Liberation Day parade, set for mid-morning along Quartermaster Road. It had already been washed out once this year by a super typhoon in July. Now the makeup date lands in the same window as Saudel's closest pass. A local meteorologist noted, with the dry humor of someone who has done this job a long time, that nature has a way of liking to rain on parades, and that there is a reason for the saying. The parade may well go ahead in nothing worse than gusty wind and squalls, but the fact that the same community has to check the forecast twice for the same celebration tells you what kind of year this has been out there. Because this has been a brutal year for these islands, and Soudel is arriving into a place that is still tired. In April, months before typhoon season normally gets going, Super Typhoon Sinlaku became the strongest tropical cyclone on the planet for the year to that point. reaching winds near 185 miles an hour, then coming ashore over Saipan and Tinian as a Category 4 with sustained winds around 145 miles an hour. It did not sweep through. It sat. Saipan's airport recorded gusts over 100 miles an hour for more than 9 hours, with a peak gust near 130 before the instrument stopped reporting. One resident described the sound not ending, saying he had never seen a typhoon that simply refused to leave. 17 people were killed. Damage across the Northern Marianas and Guam ran to roughly $1.5 billion. Then in July came Bavi, which reached Category 5 strength, with winds near 160 miles an hour and tracked toward the same islands, with the northern islands of Agrihan, Pagan, and Alamagan placed under a tropical storm watch as it approached. 2 super typhoons in one season, in a place of about 50,000 people. And now, in August, a third system is threading the northern end of the chain while rapidly intensifying. Which is why the history matters. Let me take you back 61 years, because it is the closest thing this story has to a rehearsal. In early October of 1965, a system in this same basin was upgraded to a typhoon, formed an eye, and turned north. As it approached the Northern Marianas, it underwent rapid intensification into a super typhoon in the vicinity of Agrihan. Its center passed directly above the island of Pagan, where winds of 150 knots were recorded, that is roughly 280 kilometers an hour. On Pagan, the storm's peak winds were measured. On Agrihan, the storm took everything. All of the houses were destroyed. The schools went. The dispensary went. The subsistence crops that let people live there at all were wiped out, and the coconut palms were stripped. The island lost its ability to feed the people on it, and its residents evacuated to Saipan. 7 fishing boats had sheltered on the southwest side of the island, expecting the storm to pass to the east. It did not. I am not telling you this to claim history is about to repeat itself. Soudel is forecast to be a strong typhoon near Agrihan, not a 280-kilometer-an-hour monster, and the peak intensity is forecast for after it clears the islands. But the parallel is worth sitting with for one honest reason. That storm rapidly intensified in this exact stretch of ocean, on this exact approach, and the people in its path had made a reasonable assumption about which side of the island the eye would pass. The assumption was wrong by a few miles, and a few miles was everything, which is the heart of what makes this weekend genuinely uncomfortable to forecast. Here is the part that decides everything after Sunday, and it has nothing to do with the ocean. A tropical cyclone does not choose its own direction. It is steered, pushed along the edges of large areas of high pressure, the way a leaf is carried by the shape of a river rather than by its own effort. And right now there are 2 of those high pressure systems with a hand on the wheel, and they are not steering in the same direction. The first is a subtropical ridge sitting to the northeast of the storm. That ridge is what has been pulling Soudel northwestward, and its influence is forecast to continue over the near term, with an extension of it building westward and bending the track more west-northwestward. The second is a separate subtropical ridge centered over Kyushu in southwestern Japan. That one is forecast to build southeastward later in the period, and its effect would be to keep pressing Soudel on that west-northwest heading rather than letting it curve away to the north. 2 ridges, 2 hands. If both hold their grip in the way the models expect, Soudel keeps driving west-northwest toward the Ryukyu Islands. If the northern ridge weakens even slightly at the wrong moment, the storm slips north through the gap, and everything downstream changes. Think of what is crossing the Pacific right now as a package the ocean is filling with energy while the address on the outside has not been written yet. The water decides how heavy the package gets. The ridges decide who signs for it. And that is not a figure of speech I am using to sound dramatic. Look at what the guidance itself says. Through the first 3 days, the models are in good agreement with a cross-track spread of about 130 kilometers. That is tight. That is forecasters saying they know where this thing is going through the weekend, and it is why the closest approach numbers for the Northern Islands can be published with confidence. After 3 days, it comes apart. One major global model turns the storm poleward and becomes an outlier, separating from the pack. The remaining primary guidance, along with the newer experimental artificial intelligence trackers, keeps Soudel driving west-northwest toward the Ryukyus. But even within that group, the cross-track spread at 5 days is about 333 kilometers. 333 kilometers is the difference between a storm passing harmlessly out to sea and a storm crossing directly over inhabited islands. The warning center rated its own confidence high over the first 3 days and only medium after that, which is the most honest sentence in the entire forecast package. So when you see a headline saying nobody knows where this typhoon will hit, that is not a manufactured mystery for clicks. It is the literal state of the science this week, published in plain numbers by the people doing the forecasting. Here is what the different national agencies are each watching, and it tells you how wide the threat window is. Japan's meteorological agency has warned that the typhoon may affect Okinawa and the western parts of the archipelago next week. That is the most direct statement any agency has made. And Soudel would arrive into a chain that has already had a heavy year. Southern Japan and the Ryukyus have seen a string of systems this season, and Okinawa's main island took its first significant direct strike in nearly 3 years back in June, after a long, quiet stretch. Korea's meteorological administration is watching for a different reason. By their count, a dozen typhoons have already slipped past the peninsula this summer without arriving. Soudel is the first one this season they have flagged as a system that might not slip past, because if it strengthens as forecast and then passes Okinawa on the right side of the ridge, the path north opens. Korea's southern regions have been dealing with repeated heavy rainfall damage recently, which is why forecasters there are paying attention early rather than late. The Philippines has its own stake, and it is the one most people overlook. Their Weather Bureau expects Soudel to enter the Philippine area of responsibility around the start of next week, at which point it will receive a local name. Even if the center never comes close to Philippine land, a large typhoon sitting to the northeast acts like a pump on the southwest monsoon, dragging moisture across the islands and enhancing rainfall for days. That effect is expected to run from early next week through the middle of the week. This is the quiet hazard in almost every Western Pacific storm story, the flooding that happens hundreds of kilometers from the center to people who never saw the eye at all. And China's eastern seaboard remains in the wider fan of possibilities on the outer edge of the model's spread. 4 countries, 1 storm, no answer yet. Now let me use some of this time for the part I think is more useful than any of the drama, which is telling you what to discount. First, the closest approach numbers have already moved, and they will move again. In one warning, the forecast put the center about 10 nautical miles from Pagan, 16 from Alamagan, and 43 from Agrihan. In a later warning, it read 6 nautical miles from Agrihan, 26 from Pagan, and a different figure for Saipan. Those are not errors. That is a forecast doing its job, updating every 6 hours as new satellite fixes come in. But it means any single number you see quoted, including the 6-mile figure I opened this video with, is a snapshot, not a promise. Treat the pattern as real and the precise digits as provisional. Second, be careful with the word category when different countries are talking. The 1-minute sustained wind standard used by the Joint Typhoon Warning Center produces higher numbers than the 10-minute sustained standard used by Japan and several other agencies for the same storm. When you see one source calling Soudel a Category 4 and another describing it in meters per second at a lower number, that is often not disagreement about the storm. It is 2 measuring sticks. If you compare headlines from different countries without knowing that, you will think forecasters are contradicting each other when they are describing the same system. Third, the forecast already contains its own weakening clause, and almost nobody quotes that part. Once Soudel exits the region of high ocean heat content, the intensification rate is expected to slow. After the peak, Forecasters expect lower ocean heat content, increasing wind shear, and potential eye-wall replacement cycles to cap the intensity and begin a steady, gradual weakening phase. Independent forecast tables show the storm easing from around 220 kilometers an hour to roughly 155 over the following days. That eye-wall replacement detail is worth 30 seconds of your time because it is one of the most counterintuitive things in tropical meteorology. When a very intense typhoon reaches maturity, a second ring of thunderstorms sometimes forms outside the original eye wall and slowly strangles it, cutting off its inflow. The storm's peak winds drop during this process, but the wind field usually gets wider. The strongest gusts weaken while the total area receiving damaging wind expands. So, a storm can look like it is falling apart on paper and simultaneously become a broader threat to a coastline. If Soudel goes through one of these cycles on approach to the Ryukyus next week, expect exactly that confusing headline, and now you will know what it means. Which brings me to the question I know is in the comments already. Is this El Niño? The honest answer is layered. There is an El Niño advisory in effect right now, and this is not a mild one. Forecasters place the probability of a very strong event during the coming autumn and winter at greater than 90%, and there is a meaningful chance this becomes the strongest event in the records that begin in 1950. The key Pacific Index reached around 2.7 degrees Celsius above average in mid-August. Beneath the surface, forecasters have detected localized subsurface temperature anomalies reaching 10 degrees above normal at depth, which is an enormous reservoir of stored heat waiting to be tapped. But here's the calibration. El Niño did not create Soudel. Typhoons form in the western Pacific in August in every kind of year, including cool ones. What a strong El Niño does is shift the odds and shift the geography. It tends to favor storms forming farther east in the basin, which gives them more open ocean to cross and more time to intensify before reaching land. And seasonal outlooks have flagged the potential for storms building strength over unusually warm water later in this season. Soudel forming well east of the Philippines and having days of deep warm water to work with is consistent with that pattern. Consistent with is not the same as caused by, and anyone telling you a specific storm was caused by a specific climate pattern is selling you certainty that does not exist. The more defensible statement is this. The ocean this storm is crossing is unusually warm. The pattern that keeps it warm is unusually strong, and the back half of this season was flagged in advance as the dangerous stretch. That is enough. That is alarming without any exaggeration added to it. So what do you do with all of this? If you are in the Marianas, the guidance from the Weather Service has been consistent and simple. Prepare and communicate now before conditions arrive, and stay ready for a southward shift in the track, because a modest shift is what would bring the threat down to the more populated southern island. Watches, when they come, are issued roughly 48 hours before the onset of tropical storm conditions, which sounds like a lot of time and is not, because it includes the hours when stores empty and fuel lines form. If you are in Okinawa or southwestern Japan, next week is the window to watch rather than this weekend, and the decisions that matter are the boring ones made early. Charge everything. Bring in anything on a balcony that the wind can turn into a projectile, because flying objects are the main cause of injury in these events, and wind does not distinguish between your neighbor's flower pot and your window. Build a buffer day into any travel plan crossing the Ryukyus. If you are in the Philippines, the storm may never come near you and the rainfall may still arrive. Watch the monsoon enhancement, not the center. And if you have ever sat through one of these, a typhoon, a hurricane, a night where the sound simply did not stop, I would like to hear about it. Drop the place and the year in the comments. In the last video, people from a dozen countries wrote in with storms they had never seen mentioned anywhere else, and it turned into the best thread on the channel. Here is what to actually watch over the next several days, in order. Saturday night, local time in the Marianas, the closest approach to the far northern islands. Watch whether the center passes east or west of Pagan and Agrihan, because that single detail decides whether those islands get the strong side of the storm or the sheltered side. In 1965, that same choice was the whole story. Sunday, the forecast peak. Watch whether Soudel reaches the 125-knot figure the warning center placed at the top of the model envelope or overshoots it. Multiple rapid intensification aids have already triggered, and forecasters flag that an even quicker climb is possible. Sunday into Monday, the entry into the Philippine area of responsibility, the new local name, and the first monsoon enhancement. And then Tuesday, the moment this all resolves into something, the storm is projected to reach waters roughly 500 kilometers southeast of Okinawa. Whatever the two ridges have decided by then, the address on the package gets written in that window. 4 countries are waiting to find out whose name is on it. I will be watching every update as it comes in, and if you want the answer the day it arrives rather than a week later, subscribe and turn on the bell. The next update on this one lands the moment the track locks in.